Formulator Preakness webinar alongside Mike Hogan, aka at DRF Formulator. Mike, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Pete. How are you?
Things are good. I'm out here in California while most of the racing world's eyes are at Old Hilltop. I'm out here at the Great Race Place. We've got our live bankroll contest this weekend. But in addition to all the Santa Anita races for Saturday and Sunday, our contest also includes the Preakness Stakes, which of course is where the eyes of the racing world are, trying to answer questions like, can American Pharaoh continue his run and have a shot at winning the Triple Crown this year? In the next hour or so, we're going to look at this race, one horse by one horse, try to show off some features of Formulator and talk about the key contenders and the not-so-key contenders. I also want to mention that using the tool within the webinar, folks can ask us questions. We'll try to answer some questions as we go along, and if there's some time at the end here, we can talk more generally too. So if folks have questions about specific contenders in the race, or if they just have things they want to know about Formulator, you can go ahead and submit those now, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Any questions we don't get to during the webinar, you can also feel free to hit us up on Twitter. As I mentioned, Mike is at DRF Formulator, and you can find me at Looms Boldly on there. I know Mike, like me, always tries to go out of his way to answer people's questions. We see that as part of our role here at DRF is to engage with players and hopefully make your experience in the DRF universe a little bit better. Wouldn't you say that's right, Mike?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the best parts of the job is being able to communicate and help people or even answer a question that somebody might have that they just didn't know how to ask or who to ask. You know, and it's kind of nice when you're able to help them and you see the light bulb goes on and they get something that they hadn't really understood before. That's one of the things I love about it.
It's one of the things in Formulator, particularly, you can see experienced users. There's so much stuff that this program offers that even experienced users will find things that they didn't know and then start using them. That happened to me just the other day. We were talking about run-up distances and rail placements with turf races. It's not so relevant for the Preakness, but maybe we can show that if we have some time after we go through the Preakness itself. Maybe we'll take a look back at the Dixie and show some of the Formulator bells and whistles that apply in particular to turf racing as well. But let's put a pin in that, and let's move to the 140th running of the Preakness Stakes. We want to start from the rail and move out here, Mike?
Let's do it.
Let's talk about American Pharaoh. First of all, what is your take on this horse? What do you think we're going to see from the Pharaoh come Saturday night?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of talk about, boy, the rail post is not the post you want, and there's been a lot of talk about, oh, you know, I don't know if Baffert is really as good on short rest as he is if he gives him a little bit more time. I'm not sure either of those factors are enough to beat American Pharaoh. I think if he gets beat, it's not going to be because of the short rest. It's not going to be because he drew the one hole. It might just be because another horse is a little bit better than him, and some of the concerns that folks had about both the margin of victory and how much he worked down the lane in the Kentucky Derby, you know, those might be kind of the bigger factors than whether or not he's going to be compromised by the rail.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I don't mind the rail for him. Ideally, it would be nice for Victor to have a few more tactical options breaking outside. But historically, the rail is good at Pimlico. This meet, the rail's been good at Pimlico. I can also see a situation where Victor breaks sharply, obviously from down there, the sharp break, essential. Though you could argue the same from really almost any post position. But if he can just break and get position, my best guess is we're going to see Mr. Z going straight to the lead. So I don't think he's going to have to worry about going out there by himself and being a target. I think you just establish position behind the front runners and let the race take its shape from there. I don't think this is a situation where he doesn't want to be inside. When you think of Victor and you think of the Triple Crown, think of a horse like California Chrome, who sort of famously didn't seem comfortable racing inside horses, and it sort of had that weird trip in the Pennsylvania Derby, where it seemed like Victor spent the whole race just trying to get him off the rail because he didn't seem to like being down there. I don't think that's the case with American Pharaoh. I think the rail stuff is just palaver, just stuff for people to talk about, and isn't really of that great a concern. For me, I think he has a chance in this race to show that he's the horse that many of us sort of came convinced that he was going into the Kentucky Derby. The Derby win itself, admittedly, was sort of workmanlike. It wasn't the brilliant effort that made you understand why people who clock and pick out horses for a living were comparing him to the equine equivalent of Michael Jordan. And my own theory was that he just didn't really like the track at Churchill that afternoon. And as well as he ran, the way he kind of slipped around the turns and sort of blew that second turn coming for home and had to be so hard ridden compared to his other races, that part of that was just he just wasn't getting over the sort of looser surface at Churchill Downs. And perhaps moving to a very different racing surface in Pimlico, having been in a real fight, perhaps he can show a lot better form here. I think he's between 60 and 70% to win this race. He still might not represent a value on the win end, but for me, I'm going to be looking at him on top of, I don't know, 80% of my multi-race bets, and probably keying him pretty cold on top of trifectas or superfectas in this race. But let's take a look. You mentioned about the short rest, Mike. One great thing you can do with Formulator is take a look at how trainers perform under different circumstances. And the question for every single horse in this race, this is the only time in their lives where they're going to be asked to come back and run with as little as 2 weeks rest. And Formulator can maybe give us some clues as to how horses will perform in this situation. You want to show folks how they can not only look at how Baffert does under those circumstances, but also set up sort of a macro trainer pattern that can do that for every trainer in this race fairly easily?
Absolutely, and one of the things that I like to do from a trainer standpoint is not necessarily try and drill down to every possible iteration of what the horse is being asked to do this Saturday, but just more generally look at, is this a successful move for the trainer, or is this a less than successful one, and then from there add additional filters to kind of get to exactly what it is the horse is being asked to do. So from that standpoint, what you do is you mouse over and click on the trainer, and here we click on Bob Baffert. It will show all of his runners that he has entered over the last 5 years, and you'll see that's just over 2,500 starters, 630 wins. It's a 25% win rate, which is pretty fantastic. 56 of them finished in the top 3, and for an $2 ROI of $1.69, which is about right in the window of what the takeout would be. What I like to do, and you see, all of these headers are actually clickable, so you can sort based on whatever it is you want. You can sort on the most recent ones. You can see how his recent runners have done. American Pharaoh's the most recent winner he's had. He's only had one hit the board since then. But I like to sort based on the official finish, and so that brings all of the winners to the top, so that when I click on this Modify Filters tab and we add in a bunch of different layers, the winners will be the ones that surface to the top, and then the second place finishers scroll down from there, and so on. You'll see when you click Modify Filters, which is really where all the magic within the trainer tool comes, there's a whole bunch of different filters you can use. Surface is one that's, of course, very useful. Age is good for especially 2-year-olds, but sometimes 3-year-olds coming off of long layoffs, whether they're getting LASIX or not for the first time, adding or removing blinkers, trainer and class moves, that sort of stuff can be very useful. This middle tab, ranges, is where it's going to have the days between start, and that's what we're going to focus on here. You can look at first-time starters. You can look at what horses coming off of layoffs, horses running back within 1 to 7 days. But one of the really useful features of just about every one of these filters in Formulator is you can add your own minimums and maximums. And here, what of course, the horse is being asked to do is run back on 2 weeks rest. So I want to see all of Baffert's runners in the last 5 years that have run within the last 2 weeks, or run within 2 weeks of their last start, I should say. And you'll see he's 12 for 51. That's right about his baseline 24% win rate. He's actually a little higher in terms of in the money. The ROI drops because you'll see a lot of these winners were very short prices. The longest of which was this $3.3 to 1, so that would be an $8.60 winner on a $2 bet in a 5 furlong sprint. So mostly what I like to do for this filter is this a negative or a positive for him? And here, since it's very close to his regular baseline, I don't see it as really being an issue for him. He's had a fair bit of success. Obviously, it's not the sort of thing he does all that often, only 51 out of his 2,500 starters in the last 5 years. But if we add some more filters and we want to see, okay, he's asking the horse to do it in a graded stake, one of the things you can do is you can do class level. Look at all of the horses that were in graded stakes. It's only 1 for 10, but 5 of them hit the board. Of course, it's looking at Lucky as the win in the Preakness. You'll see Bayern, who actually finished first last year in the Derby trial, but then was disqualified. He's had a couple others. Bodhisattva, of course, famously just missed by a neck in the 2012 Preakness. So it tells me that he can have horses run well, despite the fact that only he's had, looking at Lucky, win on 2 weeks rest in a graded stakes in the last 5 years. It's not a concern for me.
Yeah, and going back further, of course, you can look to his other 3 Derby winners, all of whom pulled off this trick. And I think it's pretty clear that he knows, training-wise, he's a guy I think you can definitely trust to have them ready on the short time frame. Now, obviously, this trainer stat is one that applies for every single horse in this race. And rather than have to choose those individual filters every time, there's a way you can create it so you basically have one button, right, where
correct.
You can, as we go through every trainer in this race, see this. I actually don't know how to do this myself, so I'm asking you for me. The first question comes from me. How do you set that up so you can do it in one click? I always just do it manually, which obviously is kind of a waste of time.
So you'll see here under profiles, by definition, it defaults to your default profile, which is I've set up to be just show all runners in the last 5 years. You could change this default profile if you wanted. If I can't really figure out a case for that, but if for whatever reason you think 5 years is just too long and you want it to only default to the last 2 years, you could do that. You could change your default profile. But what we want to do is we want to create a new one. So we want to click this button here and add a profile. It's going to be a new profile. We're going to name it Graded Stakes Short Rest. And you'll see, of course, that has our, well, actually I have to create my filter again since I'm adding a new one, Graded Stakes Short Rest, and I want to click Save. And so I click OK, and that is now the filter that I'm using. So then when we go back and look at the other runners, and I'll correct you just slightly, it only applies to, of course, those runners that are coming out of the Kentucky Derby, of which there are 5, but 3 of them
of course.
Are not actually being asked to return on short rest. But fair point, it applies to the majority of the field, so we can use this filter later, and then we, of course, can add or remove things if we want to see broader than just graded stakes, or if we want to see graded stake dirt routes, or whatever we think might apply to the search that we're looking to get.
You mentioned the idea of why one would change the default profile. Maybe you're a player who really primarily or exclusively plays turf races. Maybe you just want to default to have the when you click the trainer to come up all the stats in turf races. You can do that. The Formulator is fully customizable, not just in terms of the trainer tool, but also in terms of the past performances themselves. You can have them appear however you'd like. If you want to integrate the workouts into the running lines, that's an easy thing to do with Formulator, and it can sometimes create a different picture. And I know a lot of players, including Mike, prefer to look at it that way. So while you can have it look very familiar and get used to Formulator, looking a little bit more like an electronic version of the paper racing form you're used to, eventually you can get this to where it looks exactly like you want it to, and that can be a very powerful tool. Another very obvious point to look at for newer players is when you're looking at this PP on your screen and you see there's all these hyperlinks. For example, the trainer hyperlink that Mike just clicked on to show us that bit about Baffert in the trainer detail. Everything you see that's hyperlinked, everything that's blue, if you click on, there's more information to come with that. Just to give you an idea, if you're a newer viewer, how much extra information there is. You can really dig down deep into a lot of different areas of the past performance. Maybe we'll return at the end for a little bit further discussion of American Pharaoh, but in the short term, I think we should move on to Dortmund. And Mike, I know you're a big believer in the Moss pace figures, and you wanted to use Dortmund here as an example of how players might be able to display and use the Moss pace figures in Formulator to help with their handicap.
I am, and actually I'll tee it up to something you just said a few moments ago, which is modifying the past performances to suit your preferences. And I'm showing here the default, which is what you would see, kind of the online version of what you would see from a paper or a classic DRFPP standpoint. The main difference being Formulator always shows, unless you change it, lifetime running lines. And we're going to scroll down to Mr. Z, who's had 13 races, which is more than what would be shown in the paper or in Classic, because the paper only shows, I believe, 9, and Classic shows the last 12. Formulator shows every race the horses run. So if the horses run 45 races, or 46 in the case of Ben's Cat, who's running tomorrow at Pimlico, you will see every one of those, including his debut. You don't see that in any of the other DRFPP products out there. But one of the things I love to do, like you were saying, Pete, is I like to merge my workouts, and you'll see it automatically inserts the workouts within the running lines. I like to change the elapsed time to incremental splits, so you'll see that changes for each fraction, each quarter mile or mile or eighth of a mile, depending upon the length of the race. It changes the time there. And then the other thing I love is the leader and winner I changed to this horse. So you can see if the horse was not on the lead, it changes to exactly how fast that horse ran in whatever portion of the race you're looking at. One last thing you mentioned, Pete, the Moss Pace figure line. That's something I love to add. It shows up right beneath the running line for any dirt race. We don't have Moss Pace figures at this point for turf racing, but certainly for any horse that's running in the Preakness, it should apply, and it also shows up for any synthetic race as well. But getting back to Dortmund for a second, you'll see his Moss Pace figures are higher than the Moss Pace figures for American Pharaoh, at least early. So even when you go back to American Pharaoh, setting the pace in the front runner, setting the pace in the Rebel, setting the or stalking the pace just off the pace in the Arkansas Derby, you'll see these 78, 68, 70. These are lower first call pace figures than what Dortmund has shown in just about every race in his career, which tells me, a lot of times people are trying to figure out, who's going to get the lead early. It's not a foolproof way, because of course horses are animals and jockeys can also make decisions, but just at a general level, this first call pace figure is a good one to at least extrapolate who you think might be fastest early. The other thing I'll add with Moss Pace. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Pete.
No, I was in a race like this, where some of them are coming out of the same race. You have of that, because a bunch of the horses just ran against each other, but coming in from different races, that's a really valuable tool to come up with some idea of what the race shape is going to be based on the pace figures that they've ran. Looking at the raw fractions, like some people do, can be incredibly misleading, because different distances and different tracks have different run-up times. A number may appear faster, but it's not faster, because there were 50 yards, well, not that much, but 50
Right.
feet before the tell timer went on. Whereas if you're looking at pace figures, you're comparing apples to apples in terms of who's more likely to get the lead.
Right, exactly, and that's what this race shape line is really trying to capture. And this superscript number, either a plus or a minus, is the indication in terms of that race, what was the expected par for that. So here, the 86 early pace figure was 5 above what the expected par was. And so what that means is they were going a little faster earlier than could have been expected. And the nice thing about a horse like Dortmund, going faster early, you expect them to tire more late, but he pulled away in the Santa Anita Derby, which is a really nice thing to see, because usually horses that are on the lead and getting away with a slow pace, those are the ones that are going to kick away late. It's not the ones setting a fast, tiring pace early that kick away late.
What does that superscript number mean literally? I understand the scale of it, but is that 5/5 of a second? Is it something on the figure scale? What does the number mean?
It's something on the figure scale. So ultimately what it means, and if we go back to the Losal futurity here, it would expect that the initial first pace figure to be a 72. This one was an 86, which means
Gotcha.
It was 14 above the par, which in theory should support a horse to rally from off the pace, and that's where you'd want to upgrade whoever it was. And we can actually click on the chart here, and we can upgrade, and it was Mr. Z. Whoever it was that was setting that faster pace early would be expected to tire late, and somebody that was coming from off the pace would be expected to maybe to benefit from that race shape because it was such a fast, tiring early fraction.
Now, we got to talk about Dortmund's chances in the race. I was of the impression, for as much as people talked about how American Pharaoh had a perfect, quote-unquote, perfect trip in the Kentucky Derby, to me, I wasn't comfortable saying that simply because of how wide he was. While it was the perfect trip in the sense of it was a perfect tactical trip, and it was a clear trip where he didn't have anything in his way, I still, looking at the raw number of American Pharaoh in the Derby, upgrade that effort a length or two based on all that ground that he had to lose. Dortmund, to me, was the horse that had the perfect trip. He was out there. It was an even pace. I think it was described as average fast on the race shape progression in the Moss pace line. Turning for home visually looked like he should have had something left, and he didn't have something left. Now, going forward into the Preakness, because of my read on that visually, I'm not seeing why Dortmund is going to necessarily turn the tables here. But I suppose there are examples, lots of examples from history of horses who, just for whatever reason, in the Derby maybe fired less than their best, who've come back in the Preakness and run super duper well. I was on the Beating the Book podcast this morning, hosted by Gil Alexander, and one of his panelists, Marco D'Angelo, made the comparison between Dortmund and Shackelford. And I can see where one's coming from with that. I mean, for me, the problem with Dortmund is he's not going to be any kind of price here. I mean, I think the 7-2 of the morning line sounds about right to me. I'd maybe make him a tick higher, even for me personally, from a value perspective, and I wouldn't be surprised in an actual real-world betting perspective if he was even shorter than that. So for me, I'm not sure I'm willing to come up with a narrative of why he might run better, and one could construct one, especially if you look into the Bob Baffert talking after the race about how he'd suffered I don't even want to call it a bout with colic. I want to say that he had some colicky symptoms for a couple of hours in the days before the race. Maybe you want to spin a yarn that he's going to be more recovered from that and run better here. For me, though, it all comes down to the price the horse is going to be. And if I'm going to start accepting narratives like that and reasons why the horse is going to improve, personally, I think I'm going to want a higher price than the horse is going to be on Saturday. Mike, I know Dortmund was your Derby pick. How are you looking at him coming into the Preakness on Saturday?
Well, certainly I was with you, Pete. That at the top of the lane, I thought if he was the horse that I thought he was going in, he should have pulled away late, knowing how wide both Firing Line and American Pharaoh went on that turn. He cut the corner. He had the. I would say exactly what you said. He had the perfect trip, and he ultimately just had nothing late and had no answer for the top two. You're right. I could, I guess, make some sort of case that maybe he didn't like the surface as much. Maybe he needed the race in a sense after perhaps missing a day of training with that colicky symptom he had a week prior. But it's really hard for me to make too strong a case just how easily he was beaten by these top two, and I would probably need a better price than what I'm going to get on Saturday for him. But I guess stranger things have happened. It's hard to see him turning the tables.
He's got to be considered a contender. I mean, you see the record of the Derby horses coming back in the Preakness, and it's so good that anybody who ran in the Derby coming back in the Preakness gets an extra look from me. And I certainly could see including him in a saver if I had a big price in another race in the pick 4 sequence. It's a cool looking pick 4 on Saturday with a lot of full fields and interesting races. But at the end of the day, I'm kind of with you. I was just interested if you stuck to your guns on Dortmund, or if you sort of saw the Derby in the same way I did. I think we should take a look. So let's move on to sort of the soap opera of this year's Preakness Stakes. The horse you referenced before, who ran so well in the Losal Futurity, Mr. Z. Mr. Z ran in the Derby. Ran in the Arkansas Derby, both against American Pharaoh, of course. At the time, he had the same owner as American Pharaoh. And I think one can make the argument that in neither of those races was the horse ridden to win. Especially in the Derby, it seemed like he had he did have an extremely troubled trip where it seemed to me in the first 100 yards of the race, the rider was more concerned with keeping him out of American Pharaoh's way than he was with doing anything to the benefit of Mr. Z. Now, I mentioned that horses coming back actually have had, in my view, I don't have the numbers on it, but historically a lot of success in this race. I'm not saying I think that Mr. Z is going to win this race. I'm not saying I think he's even fast enough to hit the board. But I do think there's a story to be told as to why he can run a lot better and can certainly have an effect on the way this race is run. Where are you with Mr. Z, Mike, and what do we want to take a look at here in terms of Formulator?
Well, it's an interesting point, and really, I think his best race, both from a buyer figure standpoint and even visually, his best race lifetime was the Losal Futurity, where he was really, the head, it was a long head. If it was a head, it seemed more like a nose to me. The difference between those three horses in that race. And since that race, I don't know if he's regressed or maybe he they took the blinkers off in the Louisiana Derby, and he just completely tired. Big mistake. They put the blinkers back on, but then those, as you mentioned, Pete, those two races, he was facing his owner's number one horse in the barn, and I don't know if the goal there was really to get Mr. Z a win so much as to maybe see if we can see something different from American Pharaoh, at least in the Arkansas Derby, where he had never passed a horse before successfully. In that case, he did it against Bridget's Big Lovey, and Mr. Z didn't even get the lead. But then you're right, in the Kentucky Derby, it didn't seem to me like Mr. Z's goal was to really win. It was more to stay out of the way of his stablemate, who was, I believe, only a post or two out from him at the time. So if you can make a case for excusing these last few, the one without the blinkers, the two against American Pharaoh, and you bring him back to these races back here at Oaklawn and Pryor, then you absolutely can make a case for him not only hitting the board, but certainly grabbing the early lead, because these Moss pace figures 86, 84, 83, 85, even 89 back here in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, those are faster than really any horse in the field, including Dortmund. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Z is gunning it, and I wouldn't be surprised if he at least changes the race shape, if not hits the board.
Yeah, well, the other part of the narrative that I didn't really spell out there was after the Derby, it seemed that Ahmed Zayat, he had come out and said the horse isn't going to run the Preakness. Wayne Lucas, big believer in Mr. Z, actually has convinced Zayat to sell the horse to Calumet Farm, which, I mean, you couldn't have more confidence from Lucas trying to do something like that, that he at least thinks this horse has a good shot. Of course, Lucas and Calumet a couple of years ago won this race with Oxbow. I don't know. We have so many things we can take a look at here. We can take a look at Lucas let's look at Lucas on the 2 weeks rest, but then we'll from there we'll move to the potential problem with Mr. Z, which is he has to answer the question, is he fast enough? And Formulator gives you a tool to do that. But let's look at the trainer tool, and then let's check the biograph on Mr. Z.
Right. So you'll see my default profile. We've saved this new one. You'll see the other profiles that I have set up in there as well. We're going to use our graded stakes on short rest. And you'll see in the last 5 years, Dwayne Lucas is 2 for 28. The ROI is decent. That's because you get Oxbow at 15-1 with Gary Stevens aboard in the 2013 Preakness. But, you know, he's had some. This one finished, Laurie's Rocket finished third at odds of 5-2. Optimizer finished third at odds of 3-1 in the Dixie that same day that Oxbow won. It's certainly not one that's going to make me think, Oxbow aside, that the horse is likely to outrun his odds based on at least the trainer's recent experience with these type of runners.
But at the same time you say that, I hear what you're saying. If you look at those numbers, they don't inspire the confidence that Baffert does. But this is where it's so valuable that Formulator doesn't just spit out a stat and you're looking at a number and trying to interpret it. This is where when you can see all the horses' PPs who pulled this trick, and you see the one right at the top there being Oxbow. Yeah. I mean, that speaks volumes that he just did this 2 years ago. I mean, to me, that data point is maybe more relevant than the other 25. And it's also great that you can click right on Oxbow and have his PP come up. It just gives you a deeper understanding of horse racing when you're using Formulator. And there you see it. Dwayne Lucas, Calumet Farm, same connections here. And you see that 1540 win. I mean, for me, I'm not saying I like Mr. Z, and we should. While I talk about this, Mike, maybe punch up the buyer graph and we can show how that works. But for me, if I was in a contest situation, maybe a mythical win-place contest, we've got a couple of them on Saturday. We've got a credit builder at nhcqualify.com, which is actually going to sell out. So folks should go there and sign up for that. You sign up for $60 and you can win your share of up to what I think is going to be a $6,000 purse. Fund your contest play for the next few months. And we also have a qualifier for our Gulfstream Park live bankroll contest in the fall at drfqualify.com. That's just an $80 buy-in on Saturday. So if you're playing in those contests, the Preakness is, I think, the second to last race in it. And if you're pretty far back, you know, you're not going to be in a position where American Pharaoh or Dortmund or Firing Line are going to do you any good. And for me, if you've got to take a shot at a big price in this race, I think you could do worse than following along with that little narrative as to why Mr. Z could run a lot better here. You know, the Dortmund, you have to sort of believe a story to understand why he's going to turn the tables, and he's going to be 3-1, 7-2. This horse is going to be, you know, double-digit odds at least. But when it comes down to the cold, hard handicapping facts of the day, you can see where he fits in terms of speed figures on this biograph here. Mike, why don't you take us through what we're looking at exactly here?
Right. So what this is, I accessed it from the charts and graphs. It's the biograph, and it shows visually, just the buyer figure earned for each of the horses in the race going from their last race on back to their 10th race. And you'll see that there's only 2 horses in the field, Bodhisattva and Mr. Z, who have even run 10 races. In fact, Dortmund is the only one that's run more than 6. So obviously for fields where horses are a little bit more experienced, it will go all the way back to 10. But you'll see the top 3 here, which are Firing Line, Dortmund, and American Pharaoh, all essentially tower over the second group here, which is in some ways, from a speed figure standpoint, what you might call the also-rans, or the ones really aiming for the top. And you'll see the nice thing about it is you can toggle on or toggle off. And if we toggle off Mr. Z and toggle him on, you'll see he's the yellow one here. His top effort, I believe, was right here in the Los Al. That's still well below all of the efforts from the top 3 finishers. So even if he gets back to that best effort, he's probably going to have to be, oh boy, 10 to 12 to even 15 points better than it on Saturday in order to really threaten winning the race. And it's a really, especially for 2 uses. I can see this buyer graph being very useful. Just for novices, just to see, okay, who is it that's the fastest horse in the race? It really brings it into, without scrolling through and looking and having to remember what the buyer figures are. You can see at a visual, okay, it's these 3. And then the other thing is it often tells you how the public is likely to bet, because buyer figures are such a large factor in the wagering. If there's one horse that towers over the rest of the field, then likely that horse is going to be a much, much shorter price than the rest of them.
Before we move on to Danzig Moon, I just want to mention to folks that if you have questions, we still might have some time here at the end. We've got about 23 minutes left in the webinar. So if you've got questions about individual runners or about Formulator itself, feel free to post those right within the webinar app, and we'll get to as many of them as possible as we go along. Now, Danzig Moon is a horse who I was not thrilled about going into the Derby. Sort of, I would have to say, ran much better than I would have thought. Comes back here, and the case to be made for him, Chris Larmy, a very well-known contest player, actually made this point on Twitter after the sale of Mr. Z, that with that infusion of pace in the race, maybe Danzig Moon, now with a little bit more pace to run in, has a little bit more of a chance to threaten the top 3 that he wasn't quite able to threaten back in the Derby. Certainly for my money, this is a horse I'd be looking to put on the bottom rung or the bottom 2 rungs of my superfecta to maybe get some value up in here. I think he's becomes a little bit more of an interesting item given the Mr. Z drama that's gone down. One obvious question, since he's coming back from the Derby, how does Mark Casse do in these kind of spots? Why don't we use that little filter you created, Mike, to take a quick look at that?
Absolutely. And one other thing I'll note, I was impressed by his run in the Derby, and I was actually surprised at how close he was from the beginning. I thought he would be a lot further back. But you'll see Casse in graded stakes in the last 5 years on short rest, not too bad. Actually, 1 for 7, but has had 5 of the 7 hit the board, and a couple of them at very big prices. So that would be less of a concern for me with Casse. The nice thing about it is we can modify that filter. We can take a look at just all of his runners that have run back on 2 weeks rest, because the sample of 7 is not terribly large. And you'll see 17%, 46% in the money, not too bad. The ROI is low because you've had a lot of short price favorites winning. That doesn't concern me. It tells me that this is something that he's done with some success over the last 5 years. So the short rest, at least from a trainer standpoint, wouldn't be enough to knock me off Danzig Moon if I could make a case like Chris Larmy that he had a chance now with a new pace scenario to knock off the top 3.
I don't think there's a whole lot to say about Tail of Verve. He was an AE in the Derby who did not end up drawing in time. But which
actually,
we got a
Pete,
couple different angles we could take to demonstrate.
Yeah, before we go in, there was one other thing I wanted to show on Mark Cassie. The concern for me from a trainer standpoint with him is more his success or lack thereof in the last 5 years in dirt route grade ones, because he's obviously, I think, more known as a synthetic and a turf trainer. He's only had one win, and that came back in 2011 with pool play at ridiculous odds. So the ROI is okay, but 1 for 35 and only 7 out of 35 hitting the board in the last 5 years, including this horse Danzig Moon in the Bluegrass, where he was a non-threatening second to Carpe Diem, who kind of proved to be a bit of probably the biggest dud on Derby Day, at least in my opinion. This is the kind of stat from a trainer standpoint that doesn't really give me too much confidence that he's going to threaten the top 3 in Preakness.
Yeah, that is a very telling and interesting stat. It's funny that's another reason why it's so good not to. If you just look at the ROI, you think, oh, this is a club in his bag. This is something he's really good at. But then you go and you see that to have a sample of whatever it was, 35 with only 7% of the money, it gives you a little bit of pause. Of course, It doesn't do anything to dissuade me from thinking of using Danzig Moon in that 4th spot to try to maybe get a little bit of juice in the prices. Why don't we move on quickly to Tale of Verve? Despite the 7-runner field, or 8-runner field, we've actually taken a fair amount of time. I guess we've talked about two of the heavy hitters already so far, and that's part of the way the time is working out. But maybe we can move quickly through Tale of Verve and get to the rest of this field.
Absolutely. There's a couple things I wanted to show with Tale of Verve. One is we haven't clicked on the charts really yet, but if you click on the left side here, this hyperlink will take you to the race chart for each of the races. And you'll see this is Tale of Verve's win at this very mile and 3/16 distance in a maiden special weight at Keeneland last month. And you'll see he's running, and we can click on any of the PPs of the horse that he beat, finished second. Was coming off of a buyer of 49 and earned a 69 and finishing second there. The other really important thing about the charts is it defaults to the standard chart, but there's a lot of different features you can use since it is an interactive one. You can look at how the horses did in their next race. You'll see none of them have run back since, so it's obviously not valid in this case. The buyer figure one is useful, and I think is useful in this race because it shows that the top buyer of the whole field was a 77, and the top buyer one race before the race where Tale of Verve won was a 73. So we're not talking about any monsters that he beat here. And of course now he's stepping from this maiden special weight into grade 1 company, not just grade 1 company, but Triple Crown company. I guess you could spin it. The horse is going to certainly be a huge price. I guess you could spin a case where he's maybe rolling late, picking up the pieces, hitting the 3rd or 4th spot to finish out your tries or supers, but he's really going to have to step up in his 7th career start in order to even threaten hitting the board, let alone to do it.
If he's in the number, I lose. I can tell you that right now. I love that buyer chart that you just showed, and I think another great example of it comes with number 6, Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva, who won a historical prep for this race, the Tessio. But as a friend pointed out to me many years ago, despite the Tessio being a nominally important local prep for the Preakness, the class of the race, the horses coming out of it, rarely go on to make any noise in the Preakness itself. And when you click on Bodhisattva's Tessio win and you look at that buyer chart, you can take a look at the horses in that race and the kind of figures they've been running and compare them to the horses he's going to be facing here, and you can see that the water gets a lot deeper, to put it extremely mildly.
Yeah.
These horses aren't even running grade 3 numbers if you take a look at the field cumulatively, and now he's going into the grade 1. Personally, I'm not seeing any reason to show any enthusiasm whatsoever.
No.
Am I missing something here, Mike?
No, and I mean, I guess the one thing you could say is the numbers are a little better than what Tale of Verve looked like when we just looked at it in his maiden win. But you're absolutely right. The top buyer prior to the race was an 86. And even two back was Bodhisattva's 82. These are not world beaters that and I don't even know if we're talking about horses that are even going to threaten on the graded stakes level in the future. So he's one I would it would be hard for me to really make a case at him making too much noise, partly because one thing I wanted to show was he did this on the front end relatively easy here. Looked like he rallied and came back, but you'll see from a Moss pace figure standpoint, this was a negative 14, meaning it was a lot slower than what one would expect for this type of race and this type of distance. So he got away with a very easy lead, one that he's not likely to be able to replicate in the Preakness. I know we had one person ask a question if he thought Trevor McCarthy might take the lead here. I just don't see it based on his Moss pace figures compared to who he's facing on Saturday.
Yeah, he's not fast enough to get the lead over Mr. Z, or might not even be fast enough to clear the Baffert pair. I mean,
I don't think so.
Even if you don't look, even if you don't look at the specifics of the numbers over to the left side on the Moss pace, even just a quick look at the race shape progression tells the same story. That's the Moss pace line all the way over to the right, where you see it right there, very, very slow early. So. I think, and obviously, we're using these tools to tell you something that a very quick look at the form would also tell you, that Bodhisattva doesn't have much chance. But you have to remember that we're also just trying to demonstrate these tools, which can be a lot more useful, if you're looking at just your sort of average $50,000 claimer race in the summertime with horses coming from different tracks. That's where you can go through and look at that chart with the buyers and really get a much more detailed look at the class that can paint a much more important picture in your everyday handicapping. We're a little bit using a machine gun to kill a fly here, making these points about Bodhisattva, but it's in an attempt to demonstrate how these tools work.
Right, or to use another analogy, shooting fish in a barrel there.
I like it. Here's one that I really like. Let's look at Divining Rod. There was a lot of talk about the track the day of the Lexington, and I agree with it that it was a big speed-biased racetrack that Divining Rod did not benefit from. He was not on the lead in that race. Let's show folks how, by clicking on the race chart, you can then go through every relevant race on that April 11th card and get a sense of how a track was playing. Sometimes you'll see on Twitter somebody says the rail was dead that day, the rail was good that day. Well, you don't just want to take people's word for it. You want to go through the charts and look yourself. And of course, you can also, with Formulator, watch the replays, and that's another great way of doing it. We're not going to demonstrate the replays on here because it would take too much time, but that running line on the right, if you click on that, you'll see the picture. But let's show folks how you can use the charts and very easily page through an entire card and get a little bit of a sense of how the track was playing by turning the charts to the DRF comments. I think that's probably the best. I mean, you could also just look at the chart and see.
Yeah, there's a couple ways we can do it. One was, so as you had noted that it seemed to favor horses on the lead, the real quick way you can do it is look at the running lines and see where the winners came, and if they came from off the pace or if they didn't. If you think that it was not just on the lead, but that the rail was the place to be or the outside was the place to be, then you can also look at the DRF comments, which will show you tracked off the forepath, that this horse was on the rail. You can quickly go through, and the way you toggle through back and forth through the card here is, you'll see this is race 10. You can jump to whatever race you want, or you can go one by one back through. The race prior was a turf race. Doesn't really apply because we want to look at the ones on the dirt. But the ones two races back, you'll see, back to Pete's point about perhaps the lead was the place to be that day. We had a 28-to-1 shot wire the field in the maiden special weight, where horses that were off of the pace early weren't able to hit even to hit the money, that essentially it went 1, 2, 3 all the way around, kind of validating Pete's point about, perhaps what the rail, or at least in this race, that the speed was maybe where you wanted to be, or up front early is where you wanted to be. You can jump back through the other dirt race prior. Same sort of thing happened. You had a horse that was on the lead at the first call and then re-rallied down the lane. Nobody from off the pace really rallied. Your favorite was 8th early, couldn't even hit the board. That's a quick and dirty way, without watching the replays, to really just see if there was any potential bias on a given day.
I love that feature immensely. And then the other thing you can do, and maybe we should talk about this really quickly because I don't think we have another spot to do it, and then we'll get to the specific merits of Divining Rod, who's certainly worth discussion. But you can make notes. So let's show how you can go back to that chart for Divining Rod and maybe make a note that says something like, all the more impressive because this was a day when front runners did well all day. So that way you don't have to go through and page through the charts every time. You can do it a number of different ways. You can make a note for the individual horse, or actually probably the more appropriate thing to do here is to make a note for the entire card that this was a day that you wanted to be on the lead. And then any time that a horse runs back from this card, right there in your DRFPP, you'll see that this was a speed day at Keeneland, and you'll know that without having to remember, the old days people would have a list in a notebook, April 11th, great for speed at Keeneland, and eventually you'd internalize it and know it. But how much better to just have it show up and be in your racing form every time you print out a PP from that card. I think this is just one of the many ways that Formulator saves you work that in the old days you had to. In the old days, you had to have all those old racing forms or your simulcast weekly. It was the end of many a relationship, was partners being fed up with people and their stacks of racing forms in the closet to go back and pour through these old charts. Now you can make 4 clicks in Formulator and have the equivalent of that giant stack of racing forms in the closet. It's pretty fantastic and powerful stuff.
Right, yeah, so you'll see this note appears under Divining Rod. It will appear under any horse who runs back from that April 11th day at Keeneland. So any of those races, even the turf races, which is why you might want to indicate that the dirt races were the ones that seem to apply. Real quick, the other 3 types of notes are horse notes, which appear at the very bottom of the horse's PPs. Those are sometimes useful for things like if a horse scratches out, of course you don't have a running line, but you could say he scratched because he ran off in the paddock, or he flipped in the paddock, or was a vet scratch, or you could even put pedigree notes in there if you wanted. The other thing, as Pete mentioned, is...
Pedigree's a great example for this horse, because what an interesting pedigree Divining Rod has.
Right. And we'll show that in just a second, but his dam was a fantastic turf route horse. But the trip note applies. You can do one for the race, which I showed recently how to do. We had a horse that took about 4 or 5 minutes to load into a gate while the bulk of the field stood in the gate. You can put a note for that race, and all of these runners, it will show up for them. Or you can say, if for Divining Rod in particular, if we want to say rallied from off the pace on a day that favored favored front runners, we save and exit. That note, I'm not going to do it because I did one for the card. That note appears in the horse's PPs in the same area each time they run.
Yeah, the notes to me are probably the most addictive aspect of the entire Formulator program, especially for trip handicappers. You take a look at a good handicapper like Dan Illman or Matt Bernier, and you take a look at their racing forms, and every running line has its own comment of the way that they saw that race. And it's just, I mean, it's when you watch tens of thousands of races, obviously you remember a lot, but there's a lot of things you don't remember. And to be able to have that, to be able to watch those replays right in Formulator, take those notes and put them in there and have them become part of your past performances. It's just an amazing tool. Let's talk specifically. We got about 6 minutes left here. Let's talk specifically about Divining Rod, who I think is the most interesting of not really going on a limb here, but the most interesting of the new shooters in the race, and just a horse that I like a lot. I mean, Mike, I remember I actually have a note in my racing form that you had pointed this horse out as a potential Triple Crown race contender. I think it was after the allowance race.
It was actually after the maiden win. It was after the maiden win back here at Laurel.
There you go.
Yeah.
And I slugged that in there, and I agree with you. I mean, this is a big assignment, obviously, and I don't know that he's fast enough to topple the top two, but this is a horse I'll certainly be using. Another one who, depending on how the betting goes, could be my top contest-type selection in the race, and I will certainly have in the second spot of Exactas behind Pharaoh. I think that last race was very impressive. He's improving. He has the pedigree to keep improving. I love that this is a home game for him. He's trained by the Delacours, excellent horse people he's stabled in Fair Hill. So it's just a very, very logical spot for him to try. And we'll get a very interesting, we'll get a sense of where he stacks up. And he's a very interesting potential outsider to spice things up. I'm still not convinced he's good enough. And if he becomes sort of the now horse at single digits, that'll temper my enthusiasm a little bit. But I think the way the betting's going to go here, he's going to be a very important player on my Superfecta tickets. We talked before about the pedigree tool, and here it is. Why don't you talk us through what we're looking at here?
There's two ways you can access it. You can click on the dam of any individual horse, which is what I did here, and it just shows you the specifics for that horse, that dam, and her offspring. Or you can go to the analysis and stats and go to the siblings summary, which will show you this report for every runner in the field, which is particularly useful for first-time starters or more lightly raced horses. You can scroll through quickly and see what their siblings did. Divining Rod is the first foal out of Precious Kitten, so you'll see all foals out of Precious Kitten are essentially only showing him. But you can click on any of the horses within this PP, and if they've run in the last 20 years, which Precious Kitten has, you'll get their full past performances, and you'll note that they are viewed the way you have set your views. So it's showing elapsed time, or sorry, incremental time rather than elapsed. It's showing the merged workouts, and you'll see she was a fantastic turf route horse. She was a Grade 1 winner in the Gamely. She was also a Grade 1 winner in the John Mabie. She was just a kind of horse that showed up every time she ran, and obviously in Divining Rod's case, he seems to take well to the dirt, but turf could very well be his future, depending upon how he runs on Saturday.
I think that's certainly logical. They're going to have big options going down the line, and I believe, though I guess there's no way to access it here, Kitten's Joy is kin to Precious Kitten as well, right? They're halves or a full.
Yeah, so I tried to click on Kitten's first. She's too old for it to show her PPs, or she may not have even run. But Kitten's first was also the dam, aside from being the dam of Precious Kitten, was the dam of Kitten's Joy. So that makes Precious Kitten and Kitten's Joy full, I believe, full siblings.
So you're looking at a potential Arlington Million winner down the line here with Divining Rod as well, at least based on the page. We do not want to give short shrift to Firing Line. This is the horse that a lot of people are landing on. I think this is a really good use of that filter we created before, Mike, the profile, to show horses wheeling back in 2 weeks, because it's very interesting to look at Callahan in that light.
Yeah, and it's not something he's done very often, but 5 of 8 in the money, 2 for 8 winners, relatively short prices. Note both of them were with Gary Stevens aboard. And Firing Line. Oh, sorry, this is I had changed it. It's dirt route. So that's an interesting point. I had made a change here, and it saved. So that's one thing I have to make sure I don't do. We want to look at the 14-day one. So here we go. 0 for 2. Neither hit the board in graded stakes. that's a small sample. It's not one I'm going to take
no,
much from.
Can't get much from that. If you look at all of his runners, not just in the graded stakes, he does have
Right.
have a few winners.
3 for 17 within 2 weeks, including one at 13-1. So it's something he can. The layoff is not really the big concern for me. The bigger concern, and if you watch the replay, is that it looked like he never changed leads down the lane, and had he possibly changed leads, he could very well have beaten American Pharaoh. A horse that had not run 5 times prior, if I see that, I might think, oh, he's a little green or he's not professional enough. For a horse like Firing Line, it's a bit of a concern, especially on short rest, that maybe there's something else going on with him.
I agree. This is not one where the trainer stat gives me pause about the coming back in 2 weeks. It's the PPs themselves. You look at his PP, just his classic PP. 2 races stand out. You got February 7th, and you got the Derby, and both of those came on an awful lot of rest. So for me, This horse just looks like one who fires fresh. He's one I'll be looking. I mean, I'll certainly use in my supers, but one that I'll be looking to take on the win end in the Preakness. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for the webinar. We're going to be back later in the day. If you want to sign up again, we'll try to take a little bit of a different angle. Again, I don't think our question filter was working here today because we didn't end up getting any. So if you have questions, find us on Twitter, @LoomsBoldly, @DRF Formulator, or submit questions for the other webinar, and we can do it that way. But until the next time, I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale for Mike Hogan on DRF.com.